Welcome to the Tone Lounge. My name is Jonathan. Today I'm going to be giving you 10 tips on how to use a Fuzz Face style pedal with a Vox amplifier. The one I'm using is the Vox AC15. I'm going to use different guitars. And for a fuzz, well, I didn't have a genuine Fuzz Face on hand, and the ones I had weren't the best example. So I reached out to JHS and they sent out the Smiley, which is the one I'm going to be using primarily for the entire video. So what I have for you is 10 tips, but also some additional bonus tips. So if you want, just use the timestamps below to navigate to the different tips. I'm going to timestamp them and say what the tips are, so that way I'm not wasting your time if you already know some of these, and you can just jump to the ones you may not know. But if you're completely new to Vox and fuzz pedals, I would suggest watching the whole thing. I'm going to go in a logical order, and you can watch this as you please and as many times as you want. And if you have any questions, just let me know in the comment section below. So let's start with tip number 1. My first tip for you is something that might be obvious to some people and not so obvious to others. It's to ride the guitar volume. That means to play around with the different settings on the volume knob on your guitar. A classic way to use a Fuzz Face is to use a Strat. Now, with a Strat, these sound amazing, but they also sound amazing with a Les Paul. Sometimes the humbuckers or even some more modern single coils hit the front of these a little too hard. So what you might want to do is experiment with just rolling back just a bit, maybe to 9, 8, 7, somewhere in there. And you'll also find, additional tip, that by rolling back the volume on your guitar, you sometimes get a really nice glassy kind of clean tone, which is almost impossible to get without a Fuzz Face. So do experiment with that. Let's go have a listen to what it sounds like to ride the volume and even the tone knob with your guitar. Now, a very common advice to give with a Fuzz Face is to take the fuzz knob, crank it up all the way, and then just do everything with the guitar. Now, I find that this piece of advice sometimes works and sometimes doesn't, so do not forget to just roll back just a bit so you can find the sweet spot on your fuzz. They're all different. Some of them really will play well with a cranked up fuzz, but others prefer to be just backed off just a little bit, or sometimes it can be backed off quite a lot depending on what you have going on in terms of distortion. If you're going through a distorted signal, maybe through another pedal, or maybe you're going through the front of a cranked amp that's already quite distorted. So don't always take that kind of advice to heart and just try to apply it, because you may never like fuzz. So do experiment with that fuzz position on the pedal. Sometimes it's small minor tweaks that are going to get you the best results. Number 3 is that you have to be cautious with extreme temperature changes. If you bring a Fuzz Face, whether it's germanium or silicon, onto, let's say, a very hot stage and you have the sun just coming down and heating up your pedals, your fuzz face will react to that. It gets squealy and almost unusable. So if ever that's the case, do think of where you're going to be playing with these types of circuits, because they do react to cold and hot temperature changes. Tip number 4 has to do with batteries. If you use a battery with a fuzz face, the voltage that's coming in is super important, because the pedal is going to react differently depending on how much voltage is coming in. So as your battery gets depleted, the voltage is going to be starved and the pedal starts to be more gated, more spitty. That can be a very cool sound. Now, if you have batteries and you know about what voltage they're at, you can get a very specific sound, but as you use this battery, it's going to drain some more, and eventually the pedal just doesn't react the same. Now, what JHS did is put a mode switch on here, so when you kick it in, you get that starved kind of fuzz face, spitty, gated tone, but it's always constant, so you don't have to worry about how much battery drainage is going on just to keep that specific kind of sound to the pedal. It's built in. So do experiment with that. I'm going to show you that with 2 different 9-volt batteries. They're drained at different voltages right now, and the pedal is very different depending on what's, supplying power to it, basically. So let's go have a listen. Tip number 5 is probably one of the most important tips I have for you throughout this whole video. It's to equip yourself with a proper isolated power supply. And I'm saying proper because there's some that say that they're isolated, but they're really not isolated whatsoever. So I'm going to show you the noise floor that you get out of using something like the rock board. I have a rock board. I think I paid like $60 for it, power supply, versus a Chuck's DC5. And I'm not going to be playing, I'm just going to instantiate the pedal so that way you can hear the difference between the noise floor between both. I highly recommend that you do not use a daisy chain. Some people use that, and for home use, it's fine. If you're going to go on stage, it's going to bring up the noise so high, it's going to be unusable. So avoid daisy chains, avoid non-isolated power supplies, go for something quality, and all around you're going to see, you're going to hear a difference in terms of the noise that's generated with the pedals. So let's go have a listen between an affordable option and something that's much better quality. Tip number 6 has to do with a wah. Do you put it first? Do you put it after the fuzz? You're going to notice that depending on where you put it, sometimes the wah sounds like it's barely doing anything. You're going to be sweeping and you're going to be like, is it on? Like, what's happening? So you might prefer to put it after the fuzz, but it really depends on the fuzz and the particular circuit, because sometimes putting it first is going to yield whatever result you're looking for, but a lot of people, generally speaking, prefer to put the wah after the fuzz. So the fuzz would be the very first thing coming in, and right after you're going to have your wah pedal. I'm going to show you the difference. I have two different wahs. I have one from Flatley and I have one from Carl Martin. They're both very different, so I'm going to show you the difference between both of them. And also keep in mind, sometimes certain wah pedals have buffers. I'm going to come back to buffers a bit later in this video, but buffers can have very poor interaction if they are before the fuzz. So sometimes you might have to put it there regardless, because if you put it first, you're not going to enjoy the tone coming from your fuzz pedal. So let's go have a listen. Tip number 7 has to do with the boost pedal. Do you put it first or after your fuzz? If you put it first, you're sending more amplitude to your fuzz. It's not going to make it louder, it's just going to make it distort more. So you're going to get more saturation, more fuzz. If that's what you want, it's a great way to do it. But if you're looking for a volume boost so you can cut through the mix and be heard for solos, I would suggest putting that clean boost after your fuzz. Also keep in mind that a great way to do this is to use an EQ pedal where you can boost the volume but also shape the tone. Something else that people do is use something like the Tube Screamer or Klon. There are also some EQs like the All You Can Boost, which can even EQ without having the additional buffer that you would get out of something like, let's say, the Boss GE7. So if you're more careful with buffers, try to get yourself an EQ or a volume boost that doesn't have buffers. and that way you can totally shape the tone, get louder. It's a great way to do it. So EQ or tube screamer, something like that, is going to work great after your fuzz. We're going to go listen to that with the boost first and then the boost second. And I'm going to use the EQ in both ways so you can see if it's more subtle or more exaggerated in terms of results. Number 8 is what I call the fuzz killers. There's 3 culprits. The first one is a treble bleed, the second is a buffer, and the third is the bright cap. Let's start with the treble bleed. So the treble bleed mod, as you may know, is basically a mod that allows you to roll back the volume without losing too much high end. And this is a great modification, especially if you play something where you have one pedal that does all the distortion and you just use the volume to get less saturation or more saturation. What happens is that treble bleed modification with a fuzz face can react in a very different way. So that means when you go from full on to about 9 or 10, you get this huge decrease in volume and the guitar starts to get bright and spiky, which is not optimal. It's not really what you want. So if you have a standard wiring guitar, let's say a Stratocaster that hasn't been modified, as you roll back the volume, you get this really nice glassy, chimey kind of tone out of it. And if you have a treble bleed modification on your guitar, they don't sound that great with fuzz face. Second would be the buffer. So if you have a buffer, as I've talked about previously, they interact very poorly with your fuzz face. Sometimes they interact even poorly after the fuzz, which is really weird. So a great way to counter this is to get yourself a looper. There's different companies out there, so you can look out for those. One that I really like is this one here from Schnobel Tone. It's the buffer fuzz interface. You just basically isolate the buffer, not the buffer, but the fuzz from the whole pedal board by going through the send and return of this pedal. When you kick it in, you get your fuzz. When you kick it out, it's completely out of the circuit. So that way it doesn't interact negatively with buffers. And the last one is the bright cap. On your Vox AC15 or AC30, there's a bright cap on the master volume. A lot of people suggest to cut it. That requires a permanent modification to your amp. I'm not very fond of that. When you read up about how it works, when you're at lower volume, that bright switch, or bright cap rather, is kicked in. But as you crank up the master volume, it gets taken out of the circuit. So I highly recommend doing that before you do any modification. So just take the master, bring it up to about noon, or crank it up all the way. It's going to defeat the bright cap. That way you don't have to worry about modifying your amp, and it's going to play much, much better with your fuzz. Tip number 9 is to play to the fuzz. You almost play it like an instrument. If you're trying to force a riff that sounds great with something like a Boss Blues driver, and then you try to get the same articulation out of the fuzz, it's not going to sound very good. So you have to learn to adapt to what the fuzz does well and what it doesn't do well. And once you start to get that inclination where you see it more like an instrument, you may choose to use single notes. You might choose to use single notes with just the humbucker, or the humbucker and bridge, or just the bridge, or you might roll back the tone knob on your guitar to get more singing lines. So once you start to experiment with that and play to the pedal instead of forcing riffs on the pedal, you're going to get much better results. Number 10, should you use the normal channel or the top boost channel? There's a lot of disciples of the normal or top boost channel out there, and a lot of people are going to tell you, I'm just using this one exclusively. But in this case, with a fuzz face, or most fuzzes in general, I do find that the normal channel wins on this one because it has way more headroom. If you go through the top boost channel, you're going to find that it clamps down on the signal so hard that there's barely any dynamics left. Now, if you're dead set on using the treble boost, not the treble boost, but the top boost, I would suggest cranking the master volume just to give yourself some additional headroom so it doesn't sound so squished, unless that's what you're going for. But if you're not going for a totally clamped on, like no dynamics, compressed fuzz, I highly suggest going through the normal channel and still cranking up that volume. It's going to make a heck of a difference. As promised, here are 2 additional tips for the fuzz and the Vox. The first would be to experiment with the tone cut on your amplifier. A lot of people just kind of set and forget, but if you do that, you may not like the results because maybe you're cutting too much high end, or maybe you're letting too much of it come through. So I would highly suggest that you experiment, especially if you're going to make this something that's implemented permanently on your board, to experiment with the tone cut. Second is speakers. Whatever speaker came with your amp might be fine, but if you find that you tried all the tips I gave you today and you still don't like the tone, if you have access to another cab or maybe other speakers, do experiment with that. A great way to do it is to use something like the 2Notes Captor or Captor X and then try different impulse responses. And that way you get to determine which speaker would sound best with a fuzz, because usually a fuzz can be something you kick in once in a while, or it could be the core tone for whatever you're going for with your band. So do experiment with those two things, the tone cut and speakers if you can. It does make a huge difference in the end. It's all those little elements that will make the biggest impact. If you're a fan of Vox amplifiers, I have an entire series here called Vox Friendly Pedals. I have different pedals ranging from fuzz, overdrives, distortion, chorus, and whatever you can throw at a Vox in terms of pedals. It's most likely in that series. And if you're more interested in other fuzz pedals, I'm going to have a series right here that you can click on. So choose one of those two, and I'm going to see you in the next video. Cheers.